Be vegan, make peace, do good deeds, heaven, Godspeed.
Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Nos programmes offrent plusieurs langues. Veuillez visiter suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Nuestros programas ofrecen varios idiomas. Visiten suprememastertv.com/schedule.
برنامه‌های ما شامل زبان‌های بسیاری است. از این وبسایت دیدن فرمایید suprememastertv.com/schedule.
That there's not one part of our brain that is the spiritual part of our brain. And when people realize what their own spiritual or religious beliefs are, it incorporates their emotions, their thought processes, their experiences, even and their behaviors as well. So all these different ways in which we kind of interact with the world can potentially become part of our religious and spiritual practices.
Our ability to connect with God, a conversation with Dr. Andrew Newberg, part 1 of 2. Keep on watching to find out more.
By not eating meat, Jews are actually fulfilling many mitzvot, showing compassion to animals, preserving health, conserving resources, helping to feed the hungry, and preserving the earth. Mitzvot means commandments or good deeds. Dr. Richard H. Schwartz, PhD, vegan.
Tirowami. This is how the Northern Mariana Islanders say a friendly hello in Carolinian, one of the native languages much cherished by the indigenous people of the islands. My name is Kalima. The sincere people of the Northern Mariana Islands pray for eternal peace in the world. Welcome to today's show, Our Ability to Connect with God, a conversation with Dr. Andrew Newberg, part 1 of 2. Science and spirituality have traditionally been seen as separate realms, with science focusing on physical principles and technology, and spirituality on the divine connection. However, recent advancements in science, especially in the study of the brain, are blurring this divide and raising questions about the relationship between the two. As science sheds light on spiritual experiences and the workings of the mind, it raises the possibility of scientifically explaining our connection with God. Dr. Andrew Newberg timely addresses this question in landmark research books he co-authored, Why God Won't Go Away, and How God Changes Your Brain. Dr. Newberg is the Director of Research at Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a professor at Thomas Jefferson University, and is one of the 30 most influential living neuroscientists. He studies the brain of people with beliefs through scanned images taken during their practices of prayer, meditation, and sutra chanting. He concludes that spirituality is a ready ability of the human brain.
When we look at how the brain works, it looks like the brain is able to very easily engage in religious and spiritual practices, ideas, and experiences. All the brain scan studies that we've done show that there are multiple parts of the brain that seem to get involved. Now, exactly how that ability got into the brain is, of course, a much more complex and both philosophical and scientific question. The scientists would say, well, maybe it was through millions of years of evolution that because being religious or spiritual was an adaptive process, it got incorporated into the biological mechanisms of the brain. And of course, if you're a religious individual, it also makes sense that if there's a God up there and we're down here, that we would have a brain that's capable of communicating to God, praying to God, doing the things that God needs us to do. So it does look like the brain, no matter how it got there, does have this profound ability to engage in religious and spiritual experiences.
Dr. Newberg is a leading figure in a unique research field known as neurotheology, which is also known as spiritual neuroscience.
Well, for me, neurotheology is a field of scholarship that does seek to understand the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. Neurotheology really implies what, in my view, is a two-way street, that it is not just science looking at religion and spirituality. It is not just religion and spirituality saying something about science, but is the two of them working together to help us understand who we are as human beings and try to best understand all the dimensions of the human being and what makes us who we are. I think the other important point is that both sides, the neuro side as well as the theology side, have to be considered very broadly. So the neuro side can be neuroscience, it could be neuroimaging, but it could be larger medical questions about how spirituality affects us and affects our overall health and well-being. And on the other side, you have theology, which is a very specific discipline where people take a given tradition and try to analyze it. But for this term to work, we need to consider not just theology itself, ask theological questions about free will and revelation and the nature of humanity and so forth. But it also includes spiritual practices, spiritual experiences, and so forth. So there are many other aspects of the religious and spiritual realm that can be part of this whole conversation. So I think if you think about neurotheology in that regard, you actually have the ability to see how religious and spiritual ideas can come together with science in a way of trying to understand, again, who we are as human beings.
Vegan, because we are peace-loving beings.
Enlightened viewers, we'll be right back after a prayer for a benevolent vegan world. Please stay tuned to Supreme Master Television.
Russia, go home now.
Welcome back to our show, Our Ability to Connect with God, a conversation with Dr. Andrew Newberg, part 1 of 2. Ever since he was a child, Dr. Newberg was fascinated by the work of the brain. He had many questions about what constructed the sense of reality and took the brain as the starting point for seeking an answer. He studied science, then expanded to philosophy and different traditions of religions. He mastered brain imaging techniques in the field of medicine, working with Dr. Eugene G. DeQuilly, a scientist pioneer in brain imaging and spiritual neuroscience. As early as the 1990s, Dr. Newberg began to scan and observe intimately how the brain changes through religious and spiritual experiences. He shows amazing results that meditation, prayer, and mindfulness of God light up the brain images in multiple ways.
That there's not one part of our brain that is the spiritual part of our brain. When people realize what their own spiritual or religious beliefs are, it incorporates their emotions, their thought processes, their experiences, even and their behaviors as well. So all these different ways in which we kind of interact with the world can potentially become part of our religious and spiritual practices. And our research does suggest that we have this whole model of all the different parts of our brain that could potentially become involved depending on what the practice is, how the person does it, and the kinds of experiences that they have.
Dr. Newberg describes in more detail the changes observed in our brain during a profound spiritual experience.
For example, if you do a meditation practice or a prayer practice, when you start out, then typically you have an increase of activity in your frontal lobes, which are right behind your forehead. Well, interestingly, if you go kind of long enough into the practice and you have a very profound spiritual experience, then what we actually see is that frontal lobe activity starts to drop, because when that area starts to decrease, instead of feeling like you're in charge and making it all happen purposely, you kind of let yourself go, you surrender yourself. The other major part of the brain is the parietal lobe, which is located in the back of the brain. And this is an area that helps us to create our sense of self in a spatial kind of way, how we navigate through the world and distinguish ourselves from the rest of the world. Well, in a lot of these very intensive prayer and meditation practices, we have found that people have a decrease of activity in the parietal lobe. And we think that this is associated with the loss of the sense of self and the sense of oneness or connectedness, which is so frequently described in these kinds of practices. So if you feel intimately connected to God, if you feel at one with the universe, the decrease in the parietal lobe seems to be associated with that kind of an experience.
Spiritual practice is also reflected in the central part of the brain, which takes our sensory information and helps us construct our view of reality. Let's hear Dr. Newberg explain further.
Another very important part of our brain is a very central structure called the thalamus. The thalamus, in many ways, really helps us to create our perspective of reality. When people are deep in meditation or prayer, the thalamus shifts its activity levels. People who are long-term meditators, Buddhist meditators who have done this for more than 15 or 20 years, Catholic nuns who have done prayer for 40 or 50 years, we find that they sort of sit with a baseline difference in their thalamus compared to the non-spiritual population.
Let's hear Dr. Newberg explain this concept further during a TED Talk he conducted.
And you can see that at rest, both sides of the thalamus are pretty equal. But when a person engages in a practice like meditation or prayer, where they feel this intense sense of clarity and understanding, something dramatic changes in the thalamus. One side becomes much more active. And this helps us to understand how our brain rearranges and feels that sense of clarity as the person has this profound experience.
Dr. Newberg reminds us that while contemplating on God changes these key structures of the brain, the transformation is much more profound and holistic than what we see in the images.
But again, it becomes far more complicated than that. It's all of these parts of the brain functioning together in a network. So it is ultimately a very complex process that involves not only the brain, but because the brain is so intimately connected with the body, really our whole self. So if there's a spiritual part of ourself, as I like to say, it's the whole person. It's the whole part of who we are.
Vegan. You don't have to pay the damage to hell.
Russia, leave Ukraine or you reign now. Peace be with you too.
Discerning viewers, thank you for being with us today. Please tune in again on Wednesday, March 29 for part 2 of this series. Coming up next is Encouragements of Love, part 10 of 15, on Between Master and Disciples, right after Noteworthy News. May we become nobler humans in the blessing of the Most High.
Be vegan, make peace, do good deeds, hell not reach.
Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule and suprememastertv.com/SS.